city regions can play in helping to contribute to the UK's economic recovery post-COVID. It's really great to have you all here today. I've chaired countless Zoom seminars since March, but this is actually the first interactive roundtable that I'm chairing. So bear with me, we'll have to see how we make it work, but we're really keen that this is a very interactive discussion. I know lots of you are lined up and primed to talk, speak to the different questions that we're going to be exploring today, but hopefully we can make it nice and interactive. I'm going to ask you when you want to, I will pick on some of you, core cities have sort of primed me on who might want to say what on what subject. But if you would like to come in, the best way of alerting me is to let me know on the chat function. You can just sort of send me a private message and say that you would like to come in. So please do that, because we would like to make this very interactive. And please try and keep your comments limited to a couple of minutes, so everybody has a chance to come in. And I'm really delighted to be able to chair this, because we've got an absolutely stellar cast list. It's too long for me to run through, but you can see it hopefully on the slide that you should all be able to see at the moment. So lots of really important voices from the Labour movement, with a stake in kind of devolution, cities and city regions. So hopefully we'll have a really fantastic discussion today. The key questions we're going to be looking at, again, you should be able to see a slide which speaks to this. But first of all, the overarching key question is really how cities and city regions might hold the key to the economic recovery. And we know that the 11 cities that are around the table today together account for a really significant proportion of the UK's GDP, really significant proportion of the UK's university students, but we also know that actually productivity is lower than we might like, and that if we were able to increase productivity in some of these core cities to the level that we see in some cities on the continent, that could provide a massive boost to the UK's GDP, which is obviously something that we all need to be thinking about coming out of COVID. So underneath that, there are a set of questions that I know you've all been asked to think about: how we persuade the government of the need to invest in kind of local city regions in order to drive recovery. And I think this is a government that has really sort of talked the talk on devolution, but hasn't always walked the walk. We're also very interested in this question about a green recovery, so what the UK cities and city regions can do to deliver a resilient, inclusive and green recovery, so the sort of economy that we all want to see, that we know that the Labour Party has said publicly that it's committed to, and Keir Starmer has talked about. Thirdly, a political question of how we win the argument in Westminster and Whitehall. And lastly, what really needs to happen next in this agenda to unlock the growth potential of cities, towns and city regions across the UK. So these are the key questions. I think there is now a slide on housekeeping that should be coming up. Excellent, thank you. So you can see the hashtag, please do tweet about this. You can see the hashtag there that you can tweet about this. And please feel free to use the chat function to share opinions amongst the whole group and comments that I'll be able to draw on. You'll be able to select in the drop-down menu all panellists and attendees if you want to share a comment with the whole group, which you are very welcome to do. If you want to try and get my attention because you want to make a comment, you can just message me as a chair or privately, or all panellists. And I would ask all panellists to mute their microphones when not in use, but make sure you unmute yourself if you want to say something. You can also, apparently, as well as messaging me in the chat, there should be a raise your hand function at the bottom. So feel free to use either, essentially. So without further ado, I think we should kick off the debate. We've got two speakers to start the debate. Councillor Judith Blake, who is a leader of Leeds City Council and is the chair of Core Cities UK. And we're also going to have an initial thoughts from Steve Reid, who is the Shadow Secretary of State for Communities and Local Governments, to give his thoughts on Labour plans. And I guess just brief thoughts from me tricky, which is that, I mean, who would have thought that we'd sort of be here, I guess, when we were sort of all sitting around a table at Labour conference this time last year, talking about the kind of future of cities and city regions. But it really does feel it's been an incredibly difficult 6 months for regional economies, we know that. But it also feels like this is a time that's really kind of exposed some of the tensions within a sort of government agenda, which has had a lot of warm words about devolution, about giving power to cities and city regions. But actually, when we look at the response to COVID, there's been a marked reluctance when you speak to city leaders to really devolve not just aspects of economic policy, but also key aspects of the COVID public health response. And I think you've really seen the ideological reluctance there from this government to hand power over to the local level. And so I do think it's a period that has exposed those tensions, but I also think that this moment and this point in our sort of economic trajectory where the economy has obviously suffered this massive shock, it feels like it's going to be a very tricky autumn. There are really key questions for us, I think, in terms of how this should work, in terms of economic devolution, what extra powers city regions, towns should be getting, and what the best way is of sort of making the case for those from a government that has not always proved willing or able to devolve power where that is best done, for example, in the COVID public health response. So that's just a bit of scene setting from me. I am now going to ask Judith and then Steve to make some brief comments just to set us up, and then we will start to explore some of those other questions that I went through in more detail. So Judith, over to you.
Thank you, Sonia, and thank you so much for chairing this session. It's always a high spot of conference when we all get together, and it's great to be on the call and to see so many people I work with really, really closely. And we are very proud really to be here today on behalf of Core Cities, and very proud of the work that we do in all of our different cities, and we would love to do much more. I think that is got to be the theme of today's session. We do feel frustrated that we don't have the powers that we believe we deserve, and as the session says, that we believe that with those additional powers we could do so much more to unlock the economic potential of the whole country. So, as you quite rightly say, we represent an alliance of 11 cities: Belfast, Birmingham, Bristol, Cardiff, Glasgow, Leeds, Liverpool, Manchester, Newcastle, Nottingham, and Sheffield. So an impressive a list of cities, I'm sure everyone will agree. And when you actually get down to what we already contribute, we know that our city regions deliver 25% of the UK economy, 20% of trade, and home to more than 20 million people and 37.5% of university students. Our city's productivity, as you quite rightly say, is low by international standards, and we fully recognise that. And one of the stats that I think is really quite striking is if we performed at just the average of similar cities internationally, we believe we would add £100 billion a year to the UK economy. And one of our greatest arguments has been for more real devolution to our cities and our city regions. Of course, we know it isn't a panacea on its own, but greater local freedom over public spending and the ability to align services and funds in a place-based manner is absolutely what we're talking about. And quite rightly, the last 6 months has fully exposed the weakness of the centralised agenda, and it's been heartbreaking really for us to know how much better we would have performed if we had the powers and the freedoms and the resource to do things more at a local level. And that is the argument we're still locked into with government around so many of the aspects of dealing with the crisis, right from the whole range around it, the economy, right through to the public health, to protecting the most vulnerable. We have had a key part, around deprivation, in particular, the whole free school meals. But boy, did we have to argue for that to get it in the school holidays. We shouldn't have had to do that. And we've played a key role in distributing resources and funds to small businesses and helping so many people find accommodation. Those people who choose in some cases to live on our streets, but in many cases it's a situation where people have no choice at all. So the real crisis that we're facing, if you like, is not only the fact that we haven't been able to get more resource, although I think maybe today we will hear more about what we are being asked to do to support the efforts combating the virus in the next few weeks and months. But what we know is that we have suffered significant income loss. And our revenues and finances are absolutely devastated by the COVID-19 crisis. And without immediate help, many, including, I have to say, my own city of Leeds, are really facing incredible pressure and financial problems ahead. And what we know, and what the government will tell us, is that it's local authorities who have been on the front line, who have made the difference in so many different areas. And how ironic it is that while they're telling us this, we're in a position where we are actually all going through the process of looking at our services and probably having to make devastating cuts to our services from next year. Some of those impacts are already happening now, but how tragic that those people who are being celebrated for the work they've done on the front line might be the ones that are facing losing employment as a result of the government's inability to recognise just the severity of the financial problems that we're facing. And of course, this comes on top of a decade of austerity, which has had such a traumatic impact on the lives of the most vulnerable in our communities. So we're obviously really excited about working with our front bench team. I'm delighted that Steve is here today. He comes to the table with great experience personally working as a leader of a local authority, and that makes an enormous difference to us in terms of really building up the relationship of trust and confidence and being able to set out our policies together. Obviously, our focus is on the disease at the moment and how we learn to live with it in the absence of a vaccine coming forward. But what we really want to get to grips with is getting across the message that we believe absolutely wholeheartedly that cities and city regions are the key to getting the country back on its feet. And in the same way that a centralised approach hasn't worked with dealing with the pandemic, it won't work with dealing with the economic recovery. So a real opportunity to put forward our case for greater freedoms, more devolution, more devolved powers, and really linking in to the experience from around the world and how we establish our place in the world heading towards Brexit is going to be critical going forward. And I think our own spending review submission clearly underlines our view of what our place could be in delivering the framework, if you like, for our economy to thrive and putting people at the heart of everything we're doing, protecting and creating jobs and making sure that everything we do is done in an inclusive manner. So really thrilled to be here today to really get to grips with the conversations that we have to keep having on a regular basis as we move forward. I'm really looking forward to everyone's perspective on their thoughts about where we are at the moment and what more we can do through the Core Cities Network to make sure that we get our voice heard. And sadly, you know, there has been a reluctance from this government to engage with us, and we've got to all work together to collaborate to make sure that they can't ignore us, and that we can work with all of the local authority family right across the country to really make the difference we need to make. We have to be heard. We have so many ways that we can help at the moment, and we can't be denied that opportunity any longer. Thank you, Chair, and I'm delighted to hand over to Steve to give his perspective today.
Great, thanks, Judith. So, Steve, over to you. I think we're all sitting around really keen to hear what Labour would be doing differently on this agenda to this government.
Well, thank you, Sonia, and thank you very much, Judith. It's always a pleasure to hear from one of our most illustrious local government leaders, and I'm delighted to be here today, although we're not really at a round table, but a virtual round table with you all to have this conversation. Not least because it's so blatantly obvious that the current settlement is not working for Britain. This is a deeply unequal country, and that fact has been brought into very sharp relief by the effects of the COVID-19 pandemic. It's we're all still gathering data and evidence on this, including Doreen Lawrence's review, but it seems pretty clear that it's the poorest that have been hit hardest by the pandemic. And there are a number of reasons for that, but it includes poor quality overcrowded housing. That means people can't self-isolate. People doing public facing jobs. That means they're coming into contact with more people and are therefore less able to work at home or self-isolate. People on contract work or low pay with very poor access to sick pay, particularly in the early days of being off sick, also can't afford to self-isolate and therefore continue going into work even when they may be infected. And many people who are more susceptible to the effects of COVID because they have pre-existing health conditions, many of which are linked to poverty. So the deep inequality of this country that we see reflected in so many ways has been brought into even sharper relief by COVID-19. And we're already starting to see, as the recession bites, it's poorer, more marginalised, more vulnerable communities where the job losses are already happening fastest. And when you remember that there are still 7.5 million people on furlough, and that scheme comes to an end within weeks, then it's going to become very, very stark indeed who is suffering the most from this, and the potentially social harm and problems that will cause for all of us, not just those directly affected, will be immense. Of course, there was Brexit as well. Judith mentioned that too. And if you map the areas that voted for Brexit onto a map of the areas that have suffered the deepest industrial decline, there is a very, very strong correlation. It speaks once again to the deep inequality that is in our country. Now, there's an argument to be had about whether Brexit created the divides we see in our country. I think it didn't. I think it reflects something far, far deeper. And of course, there's an argument about whether in choosing Brexit, people identified the right target. But nevertheless, there was a vote for change and against the status quo by a lot of people who felt they were losing out. And they expect to see change in return for that vote. Now, one of the things, the big slogan of the Leave campaign was take back control. And that wasn't just about borders. People feel they've lost a sense of control over their identity, their place in the world, their sense of security for themselves and their children and their families. So much people felt was taken away. And so take back control really captured that. But taking back control isn't something that is going to be possible under one of the most centralising Conservative governments that we've seen in recent in recent decades. The UK is already one of the most centralised countries in Europe. Power often feels very, very remote from people, very, very unresponsive. So for me, we do need, as Judith said, to get real devolution that works for the cities and the regions so that they can take back control of their destinies and shape a better and more prosperous future for the people who live there. The first step in that will be getting power out of Westminster and opening power up. Now, the principle here that we need to be applying is subsidiarity. Decisions should always be taken as close as strategically sensible to the people who are affected by them. But that is not the way the UK currently works, certainly not the way that England works, even within the system of devolved administrations that we have across the country. Part of making that change will mean having fewer national government departments. If central government does less, you don't need so much of central government. More of that will need to be devolved. It's quite a telling truth, this, but the UK has more government ministers than France and Germany combined, without necessarily being anything like twice as effective. We accumulate power and hoard it at the centre and diminish the ability of people in cities and regions to assert power for themselves. Local decisions are better because they are more responsive to the people whose needs they are trying to meet. They are more accountable to the people who they're trying to be responsible to, and locally taken decisions will understand the local circumstances better than a decision maker who is far away from the community that's about to be affected by it. So for all of these reasons, we need a devolution settlement that is real and that works. And for me, that needs to be as broad and thoroughgoing as possible. We can look at areas like infrastructure, roads, public transport, broadband, for instance, to help bring in the investment and support strengthening local economies. We need to look at skills and training and how more of that can be determined locally. We need to look at HE, FE and education itself to make sure it's all working to equip young people from that locality for the jobs that are available in that locality, so we don't get the brain drain that we see, depriving so many of our towns and rural areas actually of much of the talent they need to thrive. They need to thrive as well. I think we can even look at elements of welfare and how that can be repurposed locally to genuinely support the needs people have, to get them back into work in their locality rather than remote, unresponsive systems that many people who use it feel humiliates them rather than helps them. And of course, with local Green New Deals and building the jobs of the future, that will be done far better if we're focusing on the needs of that locality and choices taken in that locality than if it's all determined centrally. There's a very big issue about more sustainable funding that we will need to tackle. I'm not going to be brave enough to do it here today with a member of the Shadow Treasury team sitting around the table with us as well. But we cannot go on the current basis where all local government and regional government exists purely on licence from Westminster. Keir's talked about a constitutional convention. And I think if we're going to move forward with that, as I know he wants to, then we need to look at a genuine constitutional basis for regional and local government, existing on its own right, on its own terms, and with access to the resourcing it needs to make the changes that local people expect it to deliver. So there is a huge debate for us to be having over the coming months and years as we build a manifesto for change. My final point, Sonia, is that devolution can't stop at town halls. We need what we used to call double devolution. I prefer terms like empowerment, giving people a voice and the power to assert it in their communities, in the workplace and over the public services that they use. That for me is how we rebuild trust in a broken political system, by politicians showing that we trust people, not just demanding trust from people for us. Those days of deferential politics are gone. We have to rebuild and rewire decision-making around people. Top-down decision-making is not only inefficient, it breeds frustration, particularly in the most marginalised communities, who feel too often that they are being forced into dependency on decisions made by people who have no experience of their lives in a way that saps their capacity, aspiration and self-respect, and eventually denude them of the resources they need to fight for a better future for themselves. So if we want more resilient communities, if we want to promote well-being as well as GDP as a measure of the success of this nation, we need to be building stronger, secure communities, stronger local economies with a devolution settlement that genuinely gives our cities, regions, towns, and all parts of this country the power they need to make change on their own terms.
Great, thank you, Steve, and a big thank you to Judith as well. I think those were two really good opening contributions that helped set the stage for us. One of the things that I'm quite interested in us exploring today, it's sort of the age-old question about devolution, which is there's a lot of reasons to sort of believe in it and think that it could deliver good things for local areas. But how do you sort of politically sell it on the doorstep? It's not something that kind of, you know, sort of it can be summed up in a neat sort of manifesto pledge card. So should we sort of try and make the case for that, a popular case for it? Or is it just something that you sort of quietly beat the drum for sort of behind the scenes and then do when you get in government? So I'm quite interested in exploring that question. But first of all, we're going to turn our heads to sort of really the policy question. So the question we've first been asked to address is what policy change would help the UK cities and our city regions unlock a resilient, inclusive and green recovery? And I know we've got a few people lined up to make contributions on this. We've got Andrew Carter, who runs the Centre for Cities, Professor Francesca Gaines from the University of Manchester, Professor Tony Travers from LSE, Claire Walker from the British Chamber of Commerce, and Professor Anand Menon from King's College London. So I'm going to be looking to all of you for contributions on that question, but obviously if there are other speakers, just message me privately and I will do my best to bring you in. Unless sort of one of you particularly wants to come in first, maybe Francesca, I can come to you first for a couple of minutes of thoughts.
Hi, and I'll try and be as brief as possible because I know it's important to let everybody get their voices in. And really, I want to wholeheartedly support what Judith and Steve said at the start, which is, for me, it's absolutely key that further devolution of decision-making and resources is essential to give political leaders with place-based knowledge the financial and political power to do what they know needs to be done. And that means the Treasury has to trust political leaders to work with their stakeholders and communities to develop those local industrial strategies to support the jobs of the future. I'm looking beyond this immediate crisis and thinking about building jobs, skilled jobs, secure, inclusive jobs in sustainable workplaces and industries. And for me, there's three policy asks that go along with that, and I'll try and be as brief as possible. The first is a boost to research and development funding to support what you might call lab to market developments in advanced manufacturing, digital industries, healthcare innovation, and that can build on existing place-based strengths to bring together what the world-leading developments in universities with business know-how to develop products and spin-off industries in green growth, health innovation, advanced materials. And then to support that, we need further devolution of education and skills to develop those higher level technical skills, to join up parts of the education system and try and ensure seamless and flexible training. And thirdly, I think it's essential, and it goes back to this infrastructure argument really, you need to have the data in cities and city regions to know how to target skills and business support to ensure inclusivity. And many of the sectors that are suffering from low pay, insecurity, risk of redundancy, risk of exposure to COVID, sectors like hospitality, retail and social care are ones where, for instance, women are overrepresented in the workforce. And many of the sectors where you want to grow new, secure, better paid, highly skilled jobs in the future, green industries, digital and tech, are sectors where women are underrepresented. And those risks of unemployment, low pay and insecure employment are not evenly felt. They're much higher in some communities with BME men and women at a much higher risk of facing those outcomes. So it's really important to develop targeted skills pathways and to use the commissioning and purchasing power of cities and city regions to support more inclusive employment, and to invest in skill development in sectors like social care. But underpinning all of that is the need for that Treasury trust in place-based leadership to unlock this potential. And I know Tony Travers is one of the next speakers and he'll put me right, but I think I read that we're heading for a £350 billion deficit. So I think the key argument I'd make to the Treasury is don't spoil the ship for a ha'porth of tar, invest in place-based leadership. And I think you can sell that to communities because they so much prefer having decisions made by people who understand their communities. Okay.
Great, thank you so much, Francesca. I'm going to turn to Andrew now for some comments.
Thanks, Sonia. So I think we're probably going to be all in vigorous and violent agreement on the agenda, which will make for a dull conversation in some respects. It'll, we'll confirm our own biases, but we'll be bored by the end of it. So I would say a couple of things about this sort of question about why it hasn't happened. I think is a kind of interesting sort of reflection. So as we've already heard, all of our work, all of the core cities work, Judith was referring to it. There's an enormous amount of evidence on the economy side and on the public service side that shows us the importance of our cities and city regions to the economy and to getting good public services. So there's a large and very clear evidence base that is not just UK orientated, but is international. And yet, here's my sort of first challenge. National politicians in particular have been of all stripes. So this is Conservative and Labour, and indeed not just England, but it's the same in Wales, it's the same in Northern Ireland, and it's the same in Scotland, have been slow to respond. So there's a kind of interesting question, which is, we trot out this idea that cities are very, very important, but then essentially we don't see the sort of policy responses that we would ideally want to see. And I'd offer two thoughts on maybe why that is, and two thoughts then in terms of what we might need to do about this. So the first one is, I think this agenda is often pitched, deliberately pitched in some respects, but certainly often pitched as a kind of zero-sum or beggar thy neighbour agenda, right? Cities versus towns, urban versus rural, south versus north. It's deliberately kind of set up that our cities are doing well because our towns are doing badly. The south does well because the north does badly. And actually none of that is supported by the evidence. That is just a political kind of positioning, I think, in many respects that I would offer. So we have to be much more clear about, that's my first kind of criticism or observation around maybe why we haven't made the progress that we have. And then the second kind of observation, and again, I have deep sympathy with this, because if you look at the impacts of COVID in the short term, at least, all cities and towns across the country are struggling. So yes, it's Hull and it's Blackpool, but it's also Luton and it's Crawley and it's Slough and it's London. All of our cities are struggling for a variety of reasons. But it's often pitched as we need to think about and everywhere needs support. And I think undoubtedly that is true, right? I mean, everywhere and every person, every household needs support, but we need to think much more about the type of support that we're offering, and indeed the reasons why we're offering that kind of support. When we think about, driving productivity growth, driving innovation, driving the economy, we have to think very carefully about the shape of our economy as it exists. And undoubtedly, a lot of that activity and a lot of those drivers are in and around our city regions, our big city regions. As Judith has already said, unusually they underperform rather than overperform the issue. So we need to think about how we drive and get investments into those sorts of issues. So I think that's a question that we should explore, because politicians of various persuasions will talk about devolution, will talk about the need for our cities, but then begin to think about and worry about prioritization. So my first point was, if we want real change, our politicians are going to need to be brave and prioritize investments into some places that is different than it goes into other places. We need to really think about different types of investment going into different places because of the different characteristics that they bring, and not get drawn into this sort of jam spreading or sweets for everywhere perspective where everybody has to have, or everywhere has to have the same kind of thing. And then Judith, Steve has mentioned it, Francesca just mentioned it, you know, if we are serious about improving the performance of our cities and then the surrounding towns, and that's very clearly what the evidence tells us, the better the city does, the better the surrounding towns do, and the vice versa. The weaker the city, the weaker the town's performance that is around them. If we genuinely want to improve our city's performance, then we're going to need to be very clear about the scale of the investments that we're prepared to make. You know, this is not 6 billion out of local growth fund. There's 6 billion is neither here nor there. You know, the chunks of money we are talking about are large, and they're going to need to be large and sustained. So I'll stop there. I mean, since we could go on forever, but I think, you know, thinking about that prioritization issue, thinking about why it hasn't happened so far, despite the evidence being overwhelming, I think we need to unpick that politically as well as from an evidential point of view to understand how we make progress, not just with the current government, but if we had a future Labour government as well.
Great, thank you so much, Andrew. Andrew, really interesting set of remarks there. Tony Travers, I'm going to come to you now.
Okay, well, thanks very much. Good to see everybody. Like the other speakers, I'm going to sort of park COVID and Brexit, though of course we can't. We are trying to talk about this as if it was free of those things. And the only way I want to bring them into this discussion really, and Judith alluded to this, is that they have both, one already, the other soon, created even greater dependence on central government. So local government in England and separately in Wales, Scotland and Northern Ireland is enormously dependent on the centre for powers and money. And as we speak, councils, city councils, others are having to negotiate more or less continuously with national government about replacing income they've lost and replacing or funding higher expenditure. And there's a terrible risk if those numbers don't work out that the austerity of the last 10 years will be further visited on cities and other local authorities in the coming 2 or 3. As far as devolution is concerned, there is a white paper on the stocks, but the white paper, of course, has turned into a local government reorganisation white paper, as far as I can see, which is quite a long way from devolution. And my slight fear is that we will get bogged down in a major reorganisation of Shire England. Now, nothing wrong with a reorganisation if it led to further devolution, but the difficulty is, I think we'll be told that moving to unitaries across the country will facilitate devolution at some point in future. The greater risk, I think, is that it will just lead England to end up with some of the largest district authorities, unitary authorities in the world, but without necessarily services or funding, because separately from all of this, adult social care has got to be sorted out. I doubt national government's going to give lots of extra money to that without controlling that money. Planning is moving centrally. Children's social care, I don't think, could survive in local government if adult social care was taken away or ring-fenced. So I just think we need to park the risk that we end up with very large district councils in effect, and no devolution. And that is something just to keep all our attention focused on. So more positively, we're supposed to be looking at policy changes. Well, you know, it boils down to all engines reverse, really. And by that, I mean, you know, where we've got to, and it's so easy to take this as the norm in England, UK, is the product of an almost a very long-term centralisation of power under successive governments for all sorts of reasons, some good, some less good, since 1945. And this does leave big questions about the control of schools and post-school education, health provision. You know, it is fascinating to me how, as COVID-19 has worn on, the government, through gritted teeth, has had to look to local government with its local legitimacy to begin to help out with things national government couldn't do from single desks in Whitehall or wherever they are. The less so now, several of those organisations will doubtless be abolished. So I think we've got to think about service, moving back to more services being run locally, and that would justify then a much more radical devolution of tax raising power, given that both council tax and business rates are seriously faulted, they're seriously defective taxes. I mean, business rates is not going to be usable in its recent form for some time, particularly in city centres. And separately, council tax has, needs reform. So I think that, in a sense, this points to, and this is a big challenge, I think, for the Labour Party, though it is the opposition party, therefore can make this case, the need for a new constitutional settlement. So local government has, I think, to be given a higher status where it can deliver more. And, we do know from polling, people actually like MPs on the call, you're wonderful, but councillors are quite popular compared with MPs, certainly as a group. And as a result of that, I do think this needs to be thought of, because it's such a big issue now, through the need for some sort of constitutional post-Brexit, post-COVID settlement. It's a starting point, a restart point for British democracy. And I think that would make it easier to make more radical reforms. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Tony. Another sort of really interesting set of thoughts there. One question I've always had about local tax raising is how, if you were to move to that model, you avoid the trap of having so much tax raised locally that wealthier areas get to generate more wealth through local taxation, through business rates and higher property values. So the extent to which you'd need sort of central rebalancing from central government on that. But I'm sure that's something we can come back to, and is obviously something that is resolvable. I'm just going to make a quick plea, which we've got we've got more questions to get through, and we've got quite a few speakers. So if people could really try and limit their comments to sort of 2 or 3 key points just in under 2 minutes, that would be wonderful. Otherwise, we are going to be sort of running over quite significantly. So I'm now going to come to Claire Walker from the British Chamber of Commerce. Thoughts?
Thank you, Sonia. I'll be incredibly quick and brief, but I just building on people not talking about Brexit and COVID, I just thought that there was probably one point that I wanted to make, speaking to local communities up and down the country. And I think the interesting question as we sort of navigate these really difficult times is those businesses and those areas that have seen significant lockdowns, potentially for very long periods of time, and potentially from when the rest of the economy were able to reopen, is going to be a scar that we need to address both now but also look to in the future. Now, people have, and when I speak to chambers up and down the country, they have really different views on whether or not local restrictions are impacting businesses. Many will say that they are really, really impacting some businesses and driving away confidence in an area, and then others will say, well, actually it's quite like business as usual here, and potentially then we haven't got the COVID outcomes that we want to see. I think that the local lockdown package that we saw last week was a really good indication of actually how the government at the moment hasn't got a grip on some of the more important issues around how this is affecting local communities. So for example, it was 1,500 quid if you were over a rateable value of 51,000, and slightly less if you were under that, for 3 weeks if you were entirely shut down. Now, the reason I bring this up is because I think that despite the fact that many of us have lobbied for this support, actually what's being delivered is actually not going to help anyone. First of all, they don't qualify for it. We think maybe only a few businesses in Leicester who were the early shutdowns will qualify. And secondly, it's 1,500 quid, which is hardly going to touch the sides if you're really struggling, or 1,000 depending on size of business. So I just think that this is a really important issue that we need to both think about for now, because otherwise there are going to be some areas that will be hurt much more than the rest of the country, and that will have an impact in terms of distribution of wealth. And we also need to think about it going forward in our policy thinking, particularly because in a year or 2 years' time, those economies that have been suffered the most potentially might be the ones really struggling to come out. That won't be the only driver, but that is something that I am hearing from chambers up and down the country. So I just wanted to put that COVID perspective on the broader debate.
Thank you so much, Claire. And I suspect, even though we all say that we're not talking about COVID and Brexit, it's really, really hard to avoid the context, obviously, which they set, although there are clearly much longer term issues at play here. Finally, in this section, I am going to come to Anand Menon.
Thanks, Sonia. 2 minutes suits me just fine, because actually I've been sitting here feeling like a fraud amongst all these people who know what they're talking about when it comes to local government and cities. So I'll keep it very brief and just say 3 things. Firstly, just to emphasise what Steve said about just how centralising a government this is. It's not a government that's going to talk about devolution. It's a government for whom control, ultimately, I think, has seemed to mean freedom from constraints, and freedom from any constraints, whether that's the judiciary, the civil service, or other layers of government, be them the devolves or indeed local government. And Brexit has allowed them, in a sense, to push through greater centralisation. We spent a lot of time last week talking about the internal market bill and what it meant about international law. Far less spoken about was the power grab it implied, not just from the devolved governments, and it did imply a power grab from them because of the mutual recognition provisions within it, but also the missed opportunity with the Shared Prosperity Fund. The government put forward in black and white what is a very, very centralised approach to dealing with the regional problems in this country. And to summarise my first point, I'm not at all helpful that anyone on earth can persuade this government to be less centralising, because I think it is sort of wired into their DNA. Second thing I would say, though, is if you're thinking sort of medium, longer term, there is a need not just to persuade government, but to persuade people as well that we need devolved layers of government, and we need, in a sense, another layer of politicians. It's not a popular idea with public opinion, and I think a lot of work could usefully be done now in making the case to publics around the country about the need for devolution, because ultimately the sort of slightly populist anti-politics mood extends to all areas of politics, and it is something that needs to be addressed because there is an obvious case for devolving power, an obvious economic case for having flourishing local democracy. And the final thing I'd say, because you asked for a policy change and Tony talked about services, I was really struck reading the Greater Manchester Independent Prosperity Review about the centrality they placed on having regional control over aspects of healthcare, and how closely healthcare is linked to issues around prosperity and particularly productivity. And if there was one policy that I could ask the government to put in, it would be to devolve those elements of healthcare to strong elected mayors around the country, because the evidence suggests that that would be very, very helpful to economic as well as health outcomes around the country. Thank you.
Thanks, Anand. And I think it's interesting that, because obviously that would be a sort of, huge thing for the sort of for the NHS in many ways. And I think it's interesting that, if anything, what it looks like might happen is that we see social care become more centralised rather than vice versa. But given that we've all been talking about integration since the year dot, it does seem to make sense that that happens at the local level. So I think that's a challenge for any government. Great. Well, that was a really kind of interesting question around policy. Lots of issues that came up there: services, taxation, education, and skills. Next, we're moving on really to the political, which is how do we win the political argument for this in Westminster? And I think it's helpful to sort of revisit some of the points that have been made, that really, whether you've had a government that walks the walk on this, talks the talk rather on this, we've never really seen governments fundamentally kind of tackle devolution head on, and why is that, and what could be different, I suppose, about the next Labour government, but what arguments do need to be won and how do we win them? So we've got 4 MPs who are going to contribute to this part of the discussion. So I am first going to turn to Wes Streeting, who is Shadow Secretary to the Exchequer in Labour's Treasury team.
Thanks, Sonia, and I've really enjoyed the discussion so far. One of the reasons why I was keen to join in is for 2 reasons, really. One is, having come from local government, I'm acutely aware of the challenges that local councils face, how much harder those challenges seem to have gotten with every passing year over the course of the last decade. The frustration of the sort of Whitehall knows best mentality, but also I think one of the biggest barriers to the success of this agenda is the Treasury itself. It is a culturally centralising part of government. Not only does it believe in the concentration of power in Whitehall, it believes in the concentration of power within the Treasury, within Whitehall. And you could talk to any minister from any government over many years, they will all talk about the tentacles of the Treasury. And to some degree, there are good reasons for that. And I certainly understand the appeal and the appeal of actually, former Labour Treasury ministers of the ability to pull central levers, of some of the anxiety of what happens if you distribute power and responsibility and resources, and whether that leads to sort of, an unequal set of outcomes across a whole range of public policy priorities, particularly of Labour governments that tend to want to tackle inequality, tackle injustice, and worry about whether or not letting go of power leads to that agenda being in the hands of politicians, institutions across the country that don't necessarily share those priorities. I think to some extent, the argument in favour of more power, more devolution, from an economic point of view, is already being won. I think it is a good thing that this appears to be increasingly contested territory between our 2 parties, and we're beginning to now have a row with the Tories about the extent to which they mean it when they talk about giving power to local communities, and whether they mean it when they talk about levelling up different parts of the country. But I think the shortcomings of where we are as a country have been shown up by this crisis, frankly. Some of the biggest failures of the government's response to COVID-19, whether emergency relief and food parcels and that kind of really practical response to people in crisis during this pandemic. Where the government tried to centralise, it was a disaster. When councillors were able to take charge themselves, it's been a huge success. Take so many of the examples of councils tackling homelessness, for example, during this pandemic. But I have to say, I still shudder when I hear ministers talking about how they're going to tackle unemployment and the skills shortage and the retraining. The idea that Treasury and DFE sort of mandarins will be planning centrally how we get people back into work and reskill and retrain, it just fills me with dread. Not just because the lifelong learning system has been allowed to go to rack and ruin, particularly in the last decade, but the idea that they know better about the way in which we get local and regional economies back on their feet better than the politicians who are leading those areas, and the politicians on this call like Jessie Jo and Liam and others who want to lead the economic response is for the birds. You only have to listen to some of the things that Jessie Jo and Liam have been saying about the sort of the business and the economic recovery in the West Midlands and on Teesside. Look, we've still got a long way to go. I think the argument we need to really win inside the Labour Party is that it's no coincidence that the UK has one of the most centralised systems of government and one of the most regionally imbalanced economies in the developed world. So if you want to tackle inequality, if you want to tackle injustice, that involves giving power and resources to local communities. We were asked to come up with a policy. As you know, we're not allowed to do that as frontbenchers right now. We're years away from a manifesto. So I'll just gently point you towards a pamphlet I published with the Fabian Society conveniently just before the leadership election, because I was determined to say a load of stuff before I was constrained by collective responsibility, which is, I think, the next Labour government should preside over the biggest devolution of power in British history. I think we have to tackle the lopsided approach of the current metro mayor system, which I think would bring some consistency and understanding of local communities about where decisions are made and by whom and why. What Steve said about subsidiarity was music to my ears, certainly, and probably more controversially from a Treasury point of view. I just believe without resources, devolved institutions will always be reliant on the centre, as we just heard there in the previous set of contributions. And that's why I think we have to look really carefully at local government finance settlements that provide some sense of certainty over a 3-year period, or even a 5-year period, allow for better financial planning, but also more revenue raising powers for local authorities and trusting them to make good investment decisions around things like housing. That requires a big shift of policy and culture, but I hope that's where we can get to ahead of the next general election.
Brilliant, thanks Wes, well done on having the foresight to set out every policy thought you've had ever before joining the Shadow Cabinet.
Anything I just said, I'll be fired tomorrow.
We're all stum. Hilary, I am going to come over to you for your thoughts on the political challenge around this now.
Okay, Sonia, thank you very much indeed. I want to begin by agreeing with Wes about the need to win the battle in the Labour Party. Because when you talk about devolution sometimes, Labour Party members say, well, hang on a minute, that means that a Labour government won't be able to force terrible Tory councils to do things that a Labour government wants to see happen. So although we're all kind of signed up on this call, that does not reflect all opinion. And one of the things you have to accept with devolution is that different things may happen in different places. And therefore, what is the balance between a national direction and local policy and delivery? Secondly, if we're going to make it happen, we have to get our act together. Now, Judith and I, well, Judith in particular, have been through the experience in Yorkshire of arguing for various kind of devolution deals. Why? Because we couldn't reach agreement amongst ourselves. And that's why it's been slower to get to the point we've now finally reached than was the case in other parts of the country. And I know when I was doing Steve Reed's job, councillors would come up to me and say, we can't quite agree amongst ourselves. If you become the Secretary of State, will you just adjudicate? And I always said to them, no, because it's not, we don't want Whitehall, it's Tony Travers's point, to be sitting there drawing what they think are neat maps on the wall. You decide what you want, and if you come and make a case collectively together, you'll be in a much stronger position. Thirdly, I think because of the crises, plural, we face, COVID, economic, climate, natural environment, this is a time for local government to say to central government, if you give us the tools, we can help you to do the job. I also agree with the points that have been made about the Treasury, because in many of the devolution deals thus far, they're full of strings, attachments, reporting requirements, because the Treasury thinks if things go wrong, they'll be shouted at. And in particular, the civil servants think they'll be hauled up in front of the Public Accounts Committee. And I've argued that not only must you devolve the money, but the local accountability for the spending of the money should be the council leaders or the mayors and not the officials in Whitehall. Otherwise, you're not really talking about devolution. How do we win over the public? My final point, well, talking about the things that need to be done. When we fought that rather dispiriting referendum about the idea of an assembly, we put the cart before the horse, and because nobody understood what this new group of people were going to do. So take schools. Well, Judith and I could talk at great length about having responsibility, the residual responsibility as a council in Leeds for the provision of school places, but absolutely, well, almost no power to make it happen because we can't open any schools or control what other people do. It's crazy. I don't see how you're going to have a decent social care system without a strong local element. But this is about transport and skills and housing and climate change, because that links to the point about economic development. We know what the task is. We know what needs to be done. If we're going to strip out all the gas boilers in 18 million homes and replace them with boilers that are either electric or hydrogen, well, who's going to be making the boilers and where are they going to be made? Because we need a much better connection between the policies and the practical steps we know have to be put in place and ensuring that this provides new economic opportunity for the country. And I don't know if anyone's used the word economic strategy at the moment or industrial strategy, but we need to connect those things because we've been really successful in offshore wind. It took quite a while to be building any wind turbines in Britain, and we don't want that to happen with the question of how we heat our homes and our workplaces and new forms of transport.
Great, thanks so much, Hilary. And I think given what both you and Wes have said about the Treasury, that does sort of really raise questions in my mind about what it will take to sort of reform this institution and whether that can be done with the Treasury as it exists currently, or, you know, sort of your kind of like heart drops at the thought of another Whitehall reorganisation that doesn't achieve very much potentially, but actually whether there is a case for sort of breaking up the Treasury, which I know others have made in the past. So I'll be interested in people's thoughts on that. I'm now going to come to Olivia.
Hello, and apologies, I might have to run because I'm on the list to challenge the Prime Minister on his announcement. And yeah, just firstly, I'd like to say just how great it is to be talking to the local government community again and others who are interested in it. Before coming to Parliament, I was Deputy Leader at Sheffield City Council and had spent the best part of a decade looking at cuts to our local authorities and was in charge of finance for the final 2 years of that as well. So I personally feel quite strongly that that we have to be really, really careful at the moment and make sure that we are championing local government as much as possible, because I know the choices are not getting any easier for people. In terms of devolution, I think that, you know, I think we need to have that conversation much more prominently, and I think that we have to be much more ambitious in what we want to see in our cities. And I think core cities are absolutely banging the drum for cities, but I think that, you know, just looking at some of the announcements that have come out of government recently, for example, their $3 billion for green technologies and things like that, you know, compare that to the Towns Fund, which is 3.6 billion, and you see actually how little they are taking that agenda seriously. So I think we need to think about what we want to see in our cities and how we're going to deliver that as a Labour Party. I think, you know, I really welcome the comments that have been made by colleagues about where we need to go, and I'm really pleased that we've got Steve Reed leading on our policy, because, you know, someone with that depth of experience is very much welcome. And I think that, you know, we need to really, as a party, actually make the voices of local leaders much more prominent amongst you know, if we're going to have this argument about leadership, you know, we have some excellent leaders up and down the country, not least my mother, who's on the call, and I'm not saying that because of her. I honestly believe that some of the best work over the last 10 years that we've done as a party has been in local government, and I think that that's a real credit to the people who are working so hard on the ground. But, you know, cities are completely undermined by the kind of infrastructure that we have in this country, and I think we need to keep making that argument that we have to focus on cities at some level, because if we do say what other speakers have highlighted about spreading the jam too thin, we're never going to get out of this situation where we have the massive disproportion between the southeast and the rest of the country, to be frank. And, you know, within these 11 cities that we have in the core cities, there's a huge power base there that we could call upon to really, really improve the quality of life of thousands of people living in our conurbations. And I think that skills is a huge issue, and one that I think we really need to champion. I think that the green agenda and the care agenda actually is really integral to that, and quite often, as a, you know, looking at the economy locally, I always challenge about why we don't talk about care enough, because that is going to become an increasing sector. And I think that Judith was absolutely right to say that, you know, councils at the moment are looking at their spending, and the same areas that have been challenged for years are going to be the same areas that get the chop, unfortunately, because that's all we have left in spending. So, you know, when a local government spending, you know, nearly half its budget on social care, where else can it go if it's going to be able to deliver those vital services? But, you know, we've got to attach to that economic recovery. And I think, you know, coming from a university town, and I know a lot of the core cities are university towns with great institutions, I think there's a real opportunity there to really make sure that we're honing in on skills, and that we're really trying to empower our local cities to kind of cut out a niche for themselves, whether, you know, that's on digital care, as I said, or the green technologies that we need for tomorrow. There's a huge issue with intellectual property and actually the risks of digital, and I think at the moment we focus too much on kind of the nuts and bolts of coding. Actually, we're going to need a whole generation of young people who understand the ethics of this stuff, and that's something that we should really prioritise as well, because actually we don't want this to all be centralised. We want people to have as much access and oversight of how their data is used as much as we have people in touch with their local politicians. So I think it's really, really important that we continue to have these conversations and think about the new ways that we want local government to work, and also what the powers and triggers and levers are to make sure that we're empowering as many people as possible into good, valuable economic roles in their localities, and that young people don't have to move thousands of miles, or hundreds of miles, sorry, to get the job that they're looking for. And I think that that's an absolute priority for housing as well. I could go on and on and on about this, but I know I don't have much time. But basically, I think this is a really exciting agenda, actually, and I think now's the time to actually make it much more prominent in the discussions that we're having as a party, and really challenge ourselves to think what cities could look like in 10, 15 years if a Labour government was to get in power, and what our ambitions are, and how we can convince people in Whitehall that it's a good thing to do. As a member of the PAC committee, I do regularly hold Jeremy Pocklington and others to account, so you can watch back on that and see what we've been doing on local government, because there have been some terrible decisions made centrally that have impacted right across the country. Thank you, Sonia.
Great, thank you so much, Olivia. And now I am going to come to Liam for his thought.
Great, thank you. Great discussion, great to see Steve, who's just done such brilliant work for us here in the West Midlands, helping us bring together our coalition to take what I think will be the biggest Tory scalp next year in slightly useless Tory mayor. So let me just say three very quick things about the politics of what I think we need to do next. So the first and most obvious point is that the politics of combating COVID are about to give way to the politics of combating the biggest recession that we've had since 1870. And so the frame for the argument that we need to make for more devolution is that devolution is mission critical to driving the recovery over the year or two ahead. And sometimes I don't think people quite appreciate the scale of what is coming. So if you take the West Midlands, for example, the Bank of England forecast, this is not my forecast, the Bank of England forecasts, that unemployment is going to double next year. That's up to a point that we last had in 1987. And, you know, we are busy delivering. I'm about to go to Walsall to finish delivering a couple of rounds this afternoon. We're delivering 350,000 letters across the region at the moment, asking people how they're feeling. Thousands of responses have come in already. Overwhelmingly, what people are worried about is jobs and unemployment. And the truth is, although we did some great things in the last Labour government, we have to make the case that devolution of spending is critical to driving the recovery over the months and years ahead. The second point is that there are two budgets on which we need to make a strategic strike, because the argument that we need to make is that we need the power locally to drive regional industrial policy. And there are basically two things that you need to do that. One is capital spending, and the second is human capital spending. And so I hope everybody is kind of getting their submission into the CSR deadline, which is on Thursday. But the two key points that I'll be making in my submission are these. The 5-year capital envelope that Rishi Sunak set is £358 billion. Now, it's unlikely he's going to be able to do a full CSR because there's no way you could lock down 3-year Dell's or 3-year Amy spending. But there are some big numbers that he could lock down, and the capital budget is one of the biggest. We have to make the case that we need to distribute that in different ways. So if we distribute that money in the way we do at the moment, 1/3 of that 358 billion will go to London and the South East. If we distributed that money according to population for the West Midlands, that would mean an extra £7 billion over the next 5 years. And if we reprofiled that money to bring, say, 25% of that budget forward, that would give us the £3.5 billion capital stimulus that we need to deal with unemployment that's forecast to double next year. Now, that money needs devolving, not to the kind of dog's dinner that we have at the moment of, LEPs and Metro Mayors and local authorities. I mean, we've got to devolve it to places that can offer some strategic coherence and proper prioritisation of the way that that money is spent. And obviously, we need to be putting the spending on the Green New Deal at the core of what we try and spend that capital budget on. Because frankly, the best measure for decarbonisation and job creation is retrofitting. But actually, as a way of lifting hundreds of thousands of people out of energy poverty, that capital budget could go a long way. The second thing that we need devolve control over is money that could help us deal with the huge gaps in labour productivity. And that means basically control over skills spending. Skills policy has been a shambles at central government for a long time. That is because of the frequency with which we change ministers and the lack of coherence between DFE and the DWP. But right now, we should be asking for devolved control of 5 key budgets. So 1, the huge underspend in the apprenticeship budget. 2, the Shared Prosperities Fund when that appears. 3, the National Retraining Fund. 4, the National Skills Fund. And 5, the Adult Skills Budget, which some of us have devolved control over. Actually bringing that down to a local level in a single pot could actually give us the wherewithal at a local level to deliver both the right to work and the right to train and the right to retrain and the right to an apprenticeship. That could be transformational in terms of the way that we're able to organise local labour market strategy at a sub-regional and regional level. So the politics of this will vary in different places. So for us, we want to be the capital of green manufacturing, a place of clean air, because clean air means longer lives. We want to be creating new ladders for young people because we're the youngest city in Europe. And we want to be doing everything we can to strengthen the community cohesion that has surged forward over the last 6 months. The context and the politics of how we argue for this in different places will be obviously different over the next year. But locating our call for devolved control over key budgets that we need and framing it around how we are better placed to drive the recovery, I think will be key to the politics of the next 18 months. I'll stop there, Sonia.
Punchy specific suggestions there, which is great to have. Right, we're now going to sort of move to hear from some of the local government leaders around the table about next steps in this agenda. So if I could first come to Ian Ward from Birmingham.
Thanks very much, Sonia. It's great to be participating in this discussion today. I think to answer this question, the starting point has to be that we need to make the case that growth will come from exploiting the strength of towns, cities and city regions. And that's to say the concentration of assets that support innovation and creativity that we find in those locations. So I think cities and city regions should be given a central role in driving the economic and community recovery, first of all through the spending review. And then that should be sustained through longer term reforms through the devolution white paper that the government is currently consulting upon. If we can't get it through that, then the next Labour government. I think the death of cities has often been predicted, but cities have a habit, thankfully, of proving all of these forecasts wrong. In future, the economy will depend on creativity, innovation and knowledge even more than it does now. And these things are concentrated in the businesses, the universities and people of our cities. and people will still want to access the social and economic benefits of city life, as we've seen as the lockdown was eased and people began to re-emerge in the earlier part of the summer. The core cities and their city regions, of course, make up 26% of the UK economy. So recovery is not really possible unless the cities also recover. And the cities are also places where we see most clearly the gross inequalities that the pandemic has highlighted. What sort of recovery will it be if we do not respond to those who have been hit hardest by the crisis and who are already the most excluded in our society? So specifically, I think we do need to see devolved, long-term, single funding pots to enable a strategic approach to investment in transport, green growth and housing. And whilst I don't agree with many of the proposed changes to planning policy that the government's currently consulting on, I do think we need changes in planning policy and building regulations, specifically around the energy performance of new buildings. So we've got a lever to influence that, and to buildings that are undergoing significant alterations in order that we can drive retrofitting on the back of change of use and extensions. Having said that, of course, I don't think that we can rely solely on capital investment if we are to make the changes that we require. A resilient and inclusive recovery cannot be just about investing in infrastructure. It requires action on skills, health and well-being and housing. And this means improving public services as well. It also needs investment in our cultural assets. I think if we don't get some support for arts and culture outside of London, we're likely to see that only existing in London in the future. And the key role of cities and city regions is in joining up actions on a number of fronts and providing local leadership. We can see the linkages between inclusive growth, health and well-being, public service improvements and environmental policies. And it's we that can engage with local people and stakeholders. The combined authority model can work well. It gives us scale and it gives us back the metropolitan government that was taken away in 1986, but it needs more investment and more powers. And we also need to recognise that the whole system of local public services need to be given more powers, not just the metro mayors. We in Birmingham have been calling for double devolution, an approach which recognises that local authorities must play a role in delivering on devolved functions in order that we can have spending and decision making taken at the appropriate local level and as close to the people as possible. To do that, of course, we need to be given control of flexible funding pots, and government needs to agree with us a long-term plan for investment and service improvement. The spending review needs to be place-based, regional infrastructure funds, joined up public services and funding for really local places such as neighbourhoods and local centres. To deliver all that, of course, we will need to persuade the government, and I think we need to persuade the government of two things. First of all, that cities are vital to the future economy and our recovery, and secondly, that we as local leaders can deliver. I think governments are starting to understand the first point, and they certainly understand the impact of the crisis on our city centres and urban economies. And on the second point, I think the crisis has put us in a strong position because of the way that local authorities have stepped up. Even this government can see that we've been vital to coping with the pandemic. And most people in this country can see that a more localised approach to things like track and trace would have produced better results. So I think city and city regions are the answer to unlocking growth. We just need to be given the tools to do the job, and a Labour government that allows us to take back control. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much, Ian. We've got about 10 minutes left. We've still got three people from local government to speak. So I'm going to ask people to really try and keep their comments to under 2 minutes. And I'm sure Judith and I can keep, oh, sorry about that noise in the background. I've got all the windows open. My flat is absolutely boiling here today. But I'm sure me and Judith can keep our concluding comments very, very brief to make sure that you've all got a chance to speak. But I would ask you just to sort of keep an eye on the clock as well. So next we are going to come to Councillor John Merry.
Okay, can you hear me? Yeah. Good, and it's always a pleasure to come to a Core Cities meeting, even if I'm sometimes seen as slightly an outsider, representing all the areas outside your conurbations in the key cities group. And one of the things I want to talk about is the need for unity among urban areas. Actually, it can't just be about simply the core cities driving things forward and the rest of us following behind, nor can it be about us trying to deny powers to the core cities to make their job more effective. I was born and brought up in Birmingham. I still bear the scars. My sister is deputy to Hugh Thomas in Cardiff, and I do have long conversations about the need for an urban unity in terms of approaching the government. Very quickly on the government, we have been the rescue service for central government over Brexit. We bailed them out over the whole issue about protective clothing. We supported them over track and trace and made the system work. We've dealt in terms of business grants and so forth with effective systems of administration, and we're about to embark on a new system of administration over social isolation. I think it's not a question of going to government and pleading. We need to be saying to government, we have a right to have powers devolved to us because we can deliver, yes, to a certain degree on your agenda, but more importantly on our local agendas. And it's really important that we get that message across. So I'm happy on behalf of my 22 members to work with Core Cities in terms of putting a unified approach forward on the case for urban living and the case for urban regeneration. I suppose my challenge back to you is, are you ready for that? Are you happy to be engaging with those urban conurbations to try and put forward a unified message to government about the importance of urban living, about what we can deliver?
Great, thank you so much, John. We're now going to come to Jessie Jacobs from Tees Valley.
Thank you, and it's great to be here representing Teesside and the Tees Valley. I speak both as a mayoral candidate, but also as a social entrepreneur and someone who's really interested and passionate about digital. I want to talk about inclusive growth coming from a region with a decent GVA, but some of the worst inequalities in the country. And with more time, I'll talk about devolving training, transport, planning, health, tax raising, welfare. But those things have been mentioned. I wanted to talk about something a little bit different, about digital localism, technology to grow local wealth, because this is deeply significant in the day of COVID. And I think the public get local much more than they get devolution, and we should talk about it in those terms. But also the idea that cities and regions are no longer physical spaces, they are increasingly digital spaces. And in the Tees Valley, I want us to lead the way across the UK within technology for public good, whether that is in health, education or social care. COVID ramped up digitalisation of place, but also led to even further mass extraction of local wealth, with Amazon dramatically increasing their sales at a time when local shops and producers are desperately on their knees. But can digital localism or local wealth building help turn the tide and revive our regions? Totally Locally are an organisation that champion independent retail, and they're working on a digital platform which would mean that anyone can order from their local high street as easily as it is to order from Amazon. An idea using technology to build local wealth, desperately needed if our high streets and city centres are to survive post-COVID. Let's get behind these ideas and go further. How about supporting things made and created here, whether that's music, books, clothing, pottery. During lockdown, there was a real sense of local, and I was keen to build on that and became involved in launching 2 initiatives: an online farmers market, Local Heroes, and also a local community platform, the Tees Online, which are both supporting local and finding ways to connect our consumers with the people who are making things in this area. In other areas, there are cooperative music streaming platforms that are being developed, keeping more money in the pocket of the musicians, because you only have to speak to a musician in a band to know how much money is kept by the streaming platforms and how little makes it into their pockets. So finally, what about local cooperative service platforms? From an electrician to booking your dog groomer or your Botox appointment, it won't be before we use platforms for all of these things. The venture capitalists know it and are pouring vast amounts of money into these ideas. Now we can allow the Silicon Valley to innovate and extract our local wealth, or we can be building our local platforms at a regional and city level. This will take much greater investment, it will take devolution, it will take innovation and a possible overhaul of digital taxation that doesn't penalise the small and the local. But it's well within Labour's values and our reach to be at the forefront of technology for local and social good. Look at the Open University. We should have social technology innovation hubs with significant investment into each region, prepare us for local, technological and inclusive growth to bring the prosperity that we desperately need. Thank you.
Great, thanks so much, Jessie. It's great to have the sort of digital dimension brought in there, so thank you very much. Finally, we're going to come to Councillor Hugh Thomas from Cardiff Council, and this has felt like a very England focused discussion, as discussions about sort of devolution often do, because I think we sort of think, well, Scotland and Wales have really got devolution, therefore we've cracked it, whereas of course that isn't the case. So really interested in hearing what your thoughts are, Hugh, on this.
Yeah, well, thanks, Sonia, for giving the last words to the contributor from Wales. I mean, the question asked is what should happen next, and I guess I want to make 3 points. We've talked about further devolution of responsibilities, but firstly, let's acknowledge that alone is enough. That has to come with fiscal powers as well, tax-varying powers, because with that comes accountability and also the ability to actually drive further investment and see a return on maybe what we're investing in already. So to give an example, and Ian in Birmingham rightly mentioned culture and the arts. You've got situations currently where cities are investing in major cultural events, sporting events. You know, take for example the Land of Giants in Liverpool. You know, the Champions League final we had in Cardiff a few years ago. That was a multi-million-pound investment into sport and culture. But in the current setup, there is no way for cities to monetize the return from that. You know, the income that goes into the hotel rooms, visitor economy spend is siphoned out through business rates. So we need to localize taxation regimes. I think that would be number one. Number two, let's recognise that devolution in the UK is a mess, frankly. I mean, as you said, Sonia, yes, there is devolution to Wales and Scotland, but actually within those nations, Welsh cities actually have less powers in some areas than English cities, for example, in areas of local health or business rates. And you look at the varying devolution settlements across England, then there are some regions that have competencies approaching what the Welsh government have. Then also, you know, we've not really talked about the split between metro mayors and city regions. And, you know, as an outsider looking in, the situation in England looks extremely complex. Yes, there are some good examples of it working well. I might hesitate to suggest that Manchester would be one of those. But if you take the example down the road from me, you know, in Bristol and the west of England, Mayor Marvin Rees would tell you that his Tory Metro Mayor basically stood on a platform of limiting growth in Bristol. And then you've also got the plethora of LEPs across England, which, you know, are clearly a favourite tool for business-friendly Tory ministers, but seem to me to have pretty dubious links as far as accountability to local people are concerned. And finally, I think we've got to guard against a kind of a disempowering regionalism, which distances decision-making from local communities. And I think that really fuels that conflict narrative that Andrew Carter was mentioning between cities and towns, you know, where an investment in one part of the region is seen, you know, at the expense of, or even seen to be paid for another part of the region. So I think calls for a constitutional convention on an UK level, which Labour can lead on, are well overdue. I know Carwyn Jones, the former First Minister, is making this case for many years now. Let's address properly, the questions of governance amongst the nations, and hopefully, head off of the past Scottish and Welsh nationalism. But let's also try and deliver through such a convention a clear and accountable devolution settlement that works across the entire English geography as well. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Hugh. A really invaluable perspective there. Before I just sort of say a couple of things to wrap us up, I would first like to come back to Judith, if that's okay, for any brief comments that you'd like to make, any concluding reflections?
Thank you, Sonia. I think we've got about half a minute each to wrap this up. So I just want to thank everyone for their contributions. And I know there's been some conversations in the chat which we'll pick up and take away. I want to say to John, of course, we want to work with you collaboratively. Nothing is going to work if we don't have that collaboration, that real sense of us all coming together and working on so many different aspects that have been discussed. But what I want to just say is that what we're trying to do is come up with policies that are attractive to the people out there and encouraging them to vote for us. We have to come up with, I think actually Olivia mentioned ambition. We have to be ambitious, and we have to put things forward in a way that is relevant to people's lives, and it can't just be a dry academic discussion here. This has got to be really getting down to what matters to people. So that really local agenda, what is it that will motivate people to come out and give us their support? And it has to be a positive agenda. There's so much negativity around at the moment for obvious reasons, but somehow as a party we have to cut through all of that and pull out the things that will appeal to people, and obviously new generation coming forward and thinking, what will our cities be like, our communities be like, what will we actually need to move us forward? And it has to be that future proofing in Labour Party policy that cuts through to really make a difference. I don't think we're there yet. I think actually Hillary was right. I think there is a really big debate to have in the party about what we mean by devolution. There are centralist elements within the Labour Party. I don't want to cause anyone a shock or horror, that we have to really get a hold of and be honest about it and come up with a set of policies that will be attractive within the party, really getting into what works for people's lives and hopefully getting to where we need to be in the run-up to the next general election. Meanwhile, locally, we have to keep Labour in power as well. We have to focus on that in taking our agenda forward. But thank you, everyone, for contributing. Look forward to keeping the conversations going and making the policy decisions that we need to make. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much, Judith. And just a sort of a couple of rounding up, very brief sort of thoughts from me. It's been a really rich discussion. I think the two takeaways for me are sort of going forwards in this incredibly tough economic time. First of all is, even though this has been framed as a conversation about the economy, just how much that sort of spans if we're really going to give local city regions, the powers to sort of engender economic recovery. And that spans, everything from health and social care to education and skills. So this is the breadth of this agenda, I think, is really important. And then I think the second big takeaway is, the case, the evidential case for devolution, it feels like it's made, and it's been made for years, if not decades. So there really is a political thing that we have to crack here, and I think that has two elements. It's first making the case for devolution to people and to voters, and making it something popular that people want. And I thought that Jessie's comments about calling it getting local rather than devolution is sort of, it's quite a simple point, but I think it's a really important one, and one that was very well made. And then obviously the second big challenge is the battle with the sort of centre and with the institutions at the centre, like the Treasury, but also, let's face it, ministers of all colours, who are not always so keen to give power away. So I think we've had a really good discussion around all of those things. So all that remains for me to say is a huge thank you to Core Cities UK for hosting us. Thank you to all of you for joining us, for some incredibly thoughtful contributions, and also for bearing with us as we sort of try to create this roundtable format over Zoom. I'm sure Core Cities will be interested to hear about what you thought worked well and what didn't work so well afterwards. But a huge thank you from me, and hopefully we will all see each other again soon, maybe in person in not too long. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Yeah.
Thank you. Sonia, thank you.
Oh, it's a total pleasure. Total pleasure. I hope you thought that went okay.
Yeah, that was brilliant. Thanks very much.
You again, Sonia.
Really nice to see you, Hugh. Take care. Thank you so much.
Bye.
Bye.